much. Thank you very much. I remember speaking at the very first CASETA conference, and that was actually my last year here in Texas. And Valerie Bluehart and Harold have been indefatigable in their efforts to get me to come back, and it has not been for lack of interest or enthusiasm. It's always been a scheduling nightmare. So can I just say how wonderful it is to be back here. The three things I miss most about Texas are the art, the people, and the food. You can keep the weather except for between November and February. But this is a place that shaped who I am. It gave me the courage of my convictions. I'm secretly believing that the state motto of Texas should be, "Why the hell not?" because that's the answer to everything. It didn't work. I didn't think to try it that way. What do you mean? Can we really? And it was a liberating experience to realize that this was a place in which I could experiment, stretch, and really come up with the ideas that I get most excited about. And getting excited about it is really what it's all about. If you're not having fun doing this, let's face it, why are we doing this? You are here indoors on a perfectly gorgeous day in San Antonio, Texas, in the middle of Fiesta. We all must be crazy. Of course, I expected it to be like 96 degrees by now, too, so I am thrilled to pieces that this is Chamber of Commerce weather, no matter where you are in the great state of Texas. But what I would like to do at this point is to spin out for you sort of my perspective on what happens when you leave Texas, head back home to DC, and then become deeply conflicted when someone says, "Where are you from?" And you're like, anyway, it's nice to be back. The Smithsonian American Art Museum is the single largest and most comprehensive museum of American art, period. From colonial to work that is still wet on the walls in every medium, we have roughly 44,000 works of art in the collection. And because we're in Washington, D.C., roughly every election cycle, one of your duly elected representatives gives us a call and says, "So what do you have from my state?" And we actually can run those numbers for all 50 states in the District of Columbia, which, may I say, is why you will never see a show just of Texas art at the Smithsonian, because you know what's going to happen. 49 more are going to come down the pike. And while I could have a lot of fun doing one just based on Texas, I will leave states unnamed where I don't think the pickings are quite as rich. So based on those numbers, we should be in pretty good shape when it comes to Texas art. And 6 months ago, when Valerie chased me down and said, "You will come to CASETA this year in San Antonio," and I said, "Okay," I thought, sure, I'll just go back through and find all the cool Texas things, and we'll pull them all together, and we'll have this great kumbaya moment. Yeah, well, post-World War II, we are doing an extraordinarily good job. Even starting with our front door, where Luis Jimenez's Vaquero, which he helped install, holds down the fort. It is the way we tell taxi cab drivers how to find the museum. It's like, no, it is not the National Gallery. It is not the National Portrait Gallery, thank you. It's the one with the Vaquero. You know, no, you don't know what a Vaquero is in Washington, D.C. It's a big blue horse with a guy on top of it. It's bucking. Okay, fine, we got that. We actually handed out air fresheners one year that had this on it so that the cab drivers could pin them on their rear view mirrors, and you could point to it and say, "I want to go where that is." So let's just say that Texas has played a disproportionate role in my view of our identity from the very beginning. Lincoln Gallery is the third floor of the museum where we put most of our contemporary art, and you can't take 10 steps in that gallery without bumping into a work by a Texas artist post-World War II. So, for instance, Robert Rauschenberg, it's a revelation for too many people that the man is from Beaumont, Port Arthur. I mean, it's like, oh, come on, guys. It's like, you know, read a book. It always seems to surprise people about those Texas roots, or Donald Judd, who turned Marfa into the Santa Fe of Texas. Who thought that was going to happen? But Julie Speed seems to be having a really good time down there, so I'm jealous. And in the 1960s, coming closer to home, this magnificent work by John Biggers. It is Houston's 3rd Ward, #1 from 1966, with a church burning in the background during the height of the civil rights unrest. We tell all kinds of stories with great works by James Searles from the 1980s, what I think of as sort of the golden age of contemporary Texas art, where magic realism meets root monsters, meets your worst nightmare, meets your best friend, which kind of is Texas. One of my closest friends in the state of Texas is John Alexander, who could be on the moon and he would still be a Texas artist. He may have traded living in Texas for living out on Long Island and palling around with the New York crowd, but he never really left home. And in this picture, which he painted right after he got there in 1989, it is called Living Your Life in a Goldfish Bowl. And if you get close to it, you realize there are sharks in there eating the goldfish. And that was John's East Texas take on what it was like to transplant oneself and try not to die in the process. Or another close friend, David Bates. The painting is called Bates, which is a fabulous pun on his name, but also speaks again to the vibrancy of Texas culture, no matter how you construct it. And our late and wonderful board member, Jesus Morales. We always have an artist on our board. Jesus was a kind and gentle soul who could explain contemporary art to the most hidebound board member we had and make them, if not love it, at least grudgingly accept the fact that they could vote yes. Closer to minimalism, but also evoking the roots of pre-Columbian art and that Mexican inflection that is so important to understanding what Texas art and culture is all about. So from the standpoint of post-World War II, we've kind of got things covered. We have Texans coming in, but they're not there as Texans. They are there representing the global impulses in contemporary art. And so one of the things that I tend to deal with, since my realm is the 18th and 19th century, and kind of the early 20th century, because we all kind of overlap with each other, and we're all just a bunch of opinionated curators, and you know how that goes. But that's not what you're interested in, and that's not why you're here or I'm here. And so when I dug deeper, I came to a somewhat unsettling truth. Though we are the largest and most comprehensive collection of American art, with real depth and art history 101 clout, we stumble when it comes time to tell the stories of our country from a Texian point of view. We have two areas of strength that seem logical for a federal museum, and thanks to Francine for doing an outstanding job yesterday of introducing a lot of this material and your time frame for the 1930s. She saved me a lot of words, and so I trimmed a lot of stuff last night. What we do have are mural studies. Those oil on paperboard pieces that had to be submitted to the federal government before you got your check and your commission and went off to go paint your post office murals or your schools or something. And so I thought I'd show you a selection of those that represent Texas. Our only work by Jerry Bywaters in the Smithsonian's collection is this Houston Ship Channel study and this lumber manufacturing study from Trinity. That's it. These are not the most prepossessing works of art. They are not particularly large. They're oil on cardboard, and they look like they've been hauled around and beat up by FedEx a couple of times. So when you're talking about hanging things next to, a Thomas Hart Benton or an Alexander Hogue or a Grant Wood, it's just not going to happen because these guys don't come off looking the way they need to look. So. But for instance, our only Otis Dozier is Cowboys Receiving the Mail, another one of those. Look at the credit lines and you will see some of them are transfers from the GSA, the General Services Administration, which was the logistical bureau that got you your commission. Some of them actually came through the Department of the Interior, which is also where the Smithsonian resides if you drill down very low in their budget. They don't really know we exist. We kind of like it that way right now, okay? This is not a moment you put your head up above the trenches. But we've got works by Texans I had never heard of. Nicholas Lyon, a mural study from Conroe, Texas, in the post office there that came through GSA. Ethel Edwards, another name I was not familiar with, who is represented in our collection from Lampus, Texas. And Francine mentioned Julius Waltz. Well, this is one of the studies for Coronado's exploration party from the Palo Duro series in Amarillo. Harold Bugbee, a work that transferred from the Veterans Administration. They've been in the news a little bit lately, with cowboys herding horses. So we've got these quirky things that came to us through weird channels that don't really represent what I would consider a coherent collecting initiative. And if there's one thing curators like to think is that they're coherent and that their collecting initiative makes sense. The second area you'd expect us to be strong in is in prints, because those were also in large part sponsored by or collected by GSA and other federal entities, but they're also the kinds of things that people are more likely to give you as part of clearing house. And so Florence McClung is only represented by this work, a gift of Frank McClure in 1940. It's a home front picture from 1943. Alexander Hogue with a series of lithographs, this being one of them, of Caprock Ranch, and 75 lithographs by Merritt Mawsey. Now, I like Merritt Mawsey a lot, but I'm like, how on earth 75 of them? Well, it turns out they were a gift in 1969 from the artist in memory of his wife. And so there's a story behind them. And one of the things museums should do, and a lot of them do it quite well, is we collect collectors. We collect stories. We collect heritage. We collect people who care about us, art that we can all care about. And to look at something like this, when I put these up on the walls, that story's going up there too, because I want you to have more than just a visceral response to the work of art itself. I want you to understand the impulse behind how it got here, because that's another story about how you build a national collection. We also have things that show up in the database that are not by Texans, but happen to be of Texas, and so George Catlin, viewing the cross timbers in Texas when he was down here in 1832, part of a larger body of work that is better known as Catlin's Indian Gallery, which has nothing to do with Texas, as it turns out. Leo Friedlander's Pioneer Woman of Texas. We have a huge sculpture collection. We in the Met kind of arm wrestle over who's got the bigger collection and who's got the better collection, but who's counting. And then we have classic works. We've got a Charles Umlauf sculpture of the entrance into Jerusalem that was a gift of Dale and Lacey Dorn, who live here in San Antonio. So we begin again to see the points of connection between things. And then Elizabeth Ney's Lady Macbeth from 1905, a marble that was a gift of Edmund Montgomery and Ella Debrell, who were trustees in 1998. But again, these are not works that scream Texas or that end up sort of driving you all in droves to come up to Washington, D.C. in order to see them, although the Elizabeth Ney is on view all the time. I just want you to know that. There are also Texans that show up doing other things. So our one Everett Spruce is an oil on paper piece that represents Arkansas. Well, that makes sense if you know Everett Spruce, but it's kind of like, oh, come on. You know, we got close there, but not close enough. This is a series that's called the United States series. So guess what, guys? There's one for every state, and Everett just popped up as Arkansas. Our Everett G. Jackson is San Diego. And of course, he's sometimes more closely allied with California than he is with Texas, but we all know that we still claim him. But it's nice, but if I'm sitting here putting this on view, it's like I can't tell you that a picture of the Sarah Museum Tower in San Diego is by an artist who, by the way, identifies as Texas, without spending way too many words and without boring a good number of our editors to tears. Similarly, our Andrew Dasburg, Rolling Hills, is of course the Southwest, that came in as part of Arvin Gottlieb's collection, which is mostly Taos and Santa Fe artists. And our best Buck Dunton, Fall in the Foothills, is clearly not Texas, but is a spectacularly beautiful picture and one of the icons of our Southwestern collection. And then tucked in the Luce Center is a second work called The Enemy's Horses, another gift from the Gottlieb collection and one of the true classic Western scenes. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we are with Texans here and Texans elsewhere. But when I went looking for those classic Texas modernist pieces, the ones that Francine was showing you yesterday, where you're all swooning right and left because they are flat out gorgeous, the only one that I could come up with, well, two, are Alexander Hogue. This is Young Girl in Purple from 1930, a gift of Mr. and Mrs. George L. Crawford in 1978. And the painting that always hangs, that really does hold pride of place, is Dust Bowl, which actually Rusty Tether's been in touch with me. We think the original title is actually just Dust. And thanks to his research, I am working on putting together the justification for how all that happened. What really happens is, and it's really no surprise, you let Alexander Hogue at your curatorial files, and the next thing you know, everything's retitled, he's repainted the whole thing, and he's dated it differently. Never let an artist have your work back unless you didn't like it in the first place. Donald Vogel used to do that too. He would come to the DMA and say, I never liked that person in the lower right-hand corner. I'm like, that's a prize-winning piece from the Texas State Fair. You cannot touch it. It is not yours anymore. So Hogue got into our curatorial files, and the next thing you know, the date changed and the title changed. So I'm trying to unravel all that and yet leave the cat tracks. But wherever Alexander Hogue is today, he is grinning because he rules the roost at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. His work hangs with our mural-sized Thomas Hart Benton and our gigantic cow, Ajax, by John Stewart Curry. These are the trifecta of basically regionalism up and down the middle swath of the country, which is why I kind of twitch when I think about what we could do. And I started thinking that, you know, what the Smithsonian American Art Museum does better than anybody else is we tell America's stories. We mostly do it with art off the eastern seaboard because that's where our collecting history was, but we all know there's a great big country out there. And Ron Tyler will remember this, that when I first got to Texas and we opened the Museum of the Americas in the Hammond Wing, we opened it with an exhibition from the IBM Gallery curated by two of my friends from off the East Coast called Picturing History. Except that it was picturing East Coast history. There was literally one picture that represented the entire Trans-Mississippi West. And here I am thinking, oh, that dog's not gonna hunt. So I got in touch with John and Ginny Ulick and apologized for the fact that we had somehow chased them off from outside of the good graces of the DMA and sucked them back in again by offering to put together a selection from their collection that would help us balance that history. And so we opened with two shows. We opened with Picturing History and then the Ulick collection and a symposium that really looked at history and myth-making and how this country got built coast to coast. Well, we never quite made it out to California because, you know, it was really about Texas. But what it gave us was an opportunity to realize that that's the navel gazing, that's the blinkers that occupy a lot of what we think of as your top-tier mainstream art museums. They're so busy being ecumenical that they forget to be comprehensive. Well, I have a new director who came to us from Tacoma, Washington by way of Milwaukee and Cleveland, who has looked at our collection and said, where's the rest of the country? Which is music to my ears. So I look at these three pictures as emblematic of American cultural values, the same way that, you know, Grant Wood is a wholly owned subsidiary of the state of Iowa. But we all own a piece of American Gothic. John Stewart Curry painting John Brown, he is a Kansan through and through, but John Brown belongs to all of us. And I believe the same thing should be happening with Texas. So let's take, for example, the whole notion of what we mean when we say regionalism. Well, what we mean is the Armory Show took place and took hold in New York City, and everything else became regionalism. But the Armory Show also went to Chicago, and I fantasize about what would have happened if it had taken root in Chicago instead, and Benton and Curry and Wood would be your mainstream artists, and Sloan and Bellows would be regionalism. So it all kind of depends on where your arm wrestling is and how all of that works. So Francine made the case yesterday for Texas art as American art. She shared with you the important examples of programs like the PWAP, exhibitions like the 1936 Texas Centennial, and underscored the fact that there have been moments when Texas was, in fact, in the mainstream, mostly, interestingly, clustered around that moment in the 1930s. There was one other possible time when Texas art was prepared to launch itself and stay in the mainstream, and that was in 1934 when the Museum of Modern Art hosted an exhibition they called 16 Cities, in the somewhat patronizing acknowledgement that New York might just have a little bit too much sway in shaping taste. And so they went looking for 16 different cities across the United States that also had a robust contemporary art tradition and invited them to join the party. You will notice some familiar names. You will notice a couple of familiar images. But by and large, aside from a couple of paintings then after the World's Fairs in 1934, 35, 36, migrating into New York collections, museum collections, what ended up happening was between World War II and Jackson Pollock, regionalism took a nosedive into the basements of museums across the country as abstract expressionism, followed by minimalism and pop art, ended up holding sway, and that cherished realist tradition became a little bit embarrassing to a lot of those museums. It took until then when Adair Margot made sure that Tom Lee's Rio Grande hung in the Oval Office during the administration of George W. Bush, and then went further and managed to spearhead a successful campaign to get him the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is an effort that my then director, Betsy Brune, and I had the pleasure of writing in support of, that we thought things might again change. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery, with whom we share a building, today you will see an exhibition titled The Sweat of Their Face, about labor in American history. And lo and behold, I turn a corner and there is Jerry Bywater staring me back, looking like, where have you been? The fact that we now have a national audience of close to 2 million people who are looking at John Nagel's Patrick Smith at the Forge and Jerry Bywater's Sharecropper tells me a lot about the fact that curators around the country are beginning to understand that there are images and idioms and artworks coming from Texas that have something resonant to add at the national level. So I come to you today, a la Jonathan Swift, with a modest proposal. I need to be able to tell more of those American stories from a Texas perspective. It's not going to take a huge number of works to do this, but I'm thinking 10 or 15. But I'm going to say it's time to get Texas art out of Texas. When Peter Marzio was organizing John Alexander's mid-career retrospective, he came to me and he said, Eleanor, he said, we need to get Johnny out of Texas. And I said, yeah, you do. And he said, he needs to be on view here. And I said, I'm totally on board with that. And so we fought tooth and nail, and we got his exhibition there in 2006, right before it came to Houston for his sort of, big spiffy homecoming. And what it ended up doing was helping people to understand that you can love something too much. You can hold on to so much of it that nobody else really gets it. And that's how things end up getting sequestered and marginalized. I want a national audience to get the message about what you guys already know about how fabulous, how wonderful, how resonant and meaningful the art that has been made in this state really is. So we know that the best Texas art can hang with the best art, period, end of story. For instance, the work that you see on the lower left is R. William Merritt Chase of Shinnecock Hills. One of William Merritt Chase's most talented students was Julian Onderdonk, and yet there is not a single work by a single Onderdonk in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Not Robert, not Julian, not Eleanor. We have a miniatures collection of close to 500 works and not a single Eleanor Onderdonk miniature among them. It kills me to believe this. Of course, I've proselytized to like Claude Albritton that maybe he might let go of one of the Julian Onderdonks. So next time you see Claude, you might want to nudge him that direction and no, I don't want a little dinky one. I want one of the ones that's going to make him cry. Like that one, for instance. I want a Herman Lundquist. I remember the first time I walked into someone's living room and saw a Herman Lundquist oil and a number of the works on paper, and I literally just was dumbstruck. And coming at this field, studying 19th century American landscape painting, you look at Albert Bierstadt's Westphalian scenes from his first trip back to Germany in the upper left-hand corner, and you understand just how good Lundquist can be and just how well he can hang with the rest of the 19th century artists. I get tired of people doing the old, what, they had culture in Texas in the 19th century? It's like, yes, they did. Of course, I ran into that in 1992 when I came to you from the MFA Boston, and I was asked up there whether or not they had hot and cold running water and indoor plumbing. And the first time I called back to my friends, I just said, howdy. And they're like, what? And I'm like, it's the only word I know. Because you can't have too much fun with these people. But you know, Herman Lundquist is doing history paintings, he's doing genre paintings, he's doing landscape paintings, he is painting the Texas experience, the German-American Texas experience, which is so critical to understanding Texas in the 19th century, as well as America in the 19th century. How the heck am I supposed to tell the history of Texas without a decent picture of the Alamo? This is Seymour Thomas. It's a pretty nice one, but you know, I'm open to suggestion on this one. But you know, I have paintings of signature places and signature moments from other parts of the country, and I am stunned that I literally come up empty when I type in Alamo into our search engine. And I did spell it correctly. There's the issue of urban growth that this William Elliott painting gives you an idea of, that, you know, urban dialogue is a reminder that a frontier is wherever you break new ground and envision the future, which is just totally endemic to Texas. This is where I learned that you dig first and ask for permits later, except when it comes to the Alamo. Everything else is fungible because we're about building the future, and that is exactly what's going on in this particular painting. I think about those mural studies, and then I think about what Thomas Stell did in this Untitled mural, and what I see is not just an answer to the expediency of the 1930s WPA and post office mural movement, but I see someone who is responding to what Thomas Hart Benton is doing, understanding that America is a culture writ large and can handle a really large canvas in order to get the point across. Art Benton, by the way, was rescued out of a Kansas City department store that was going to be demolished, and we were kind of given the, you've got 48 hours, if you can get it out of here, it's yours. Our Louise Nevelson came out of a New York City skyscraper that had been sold, and again, it was like, we're just going to cut it up, and if you don't want that to happen, you come get it yourself. And you know, we may not be Texans in Washington, but we've got gumption, and so we do rescue projects. And we ended up with both of those. We do have, as I said, a really strong contingent of mid-century realism, because Paul Manship, the sculptor, was the head of our board from 1934 to 1964. He thought Reginald Marsh was kind of out there on the edge, which means we flat missed abstract expressionism, minimalism, and pop art, because that just wasn't his idiom. But his collecting initiative in realism was still regionally inflected and regionally restricted. And so when I look at something like Travis's Workman, which Francine showed yesterday from 1929, and I look at a painting we have in the collection by Tyrone Comfort called Gold is Where You Find It, there is this idea of looking at that power and determination that is the American character. They are both local stories, but they resonate nationally. And it's lifting locally revered artists into national prominence that is something I'm deeply committed to, and you can thank 10 years here in Texas for my desire to adjust the canon to give you a broader swath of artists that are examining the American scene. Gender becomes an issue. Florence McClung's Jackson's Gin in the upper left-hand corner and Swamp King down in the bottom. Other than that one print that I showed you, she is completely missing from the national narrative. And whether she's painting East Texas or the High Plains, hers is a powerful reminder that Texas has nurtured an impressive number of talented women artists, which redresses another glaring imbalance in 19th and early 20th century art. 2020, the Smithsonian has declared, is the year of the woman at the Smithsonian. We've been charged with identifying the art, the artifacts, the people, and the stories of the women who have helped shape this nation. I look at our art collection, and outside of one Sarah Miriam Peele, and then you fast forward to Mary Cassatt, and then you fast forward to the late 20th century, and I am completely horrified. So my job is to do something about that. There may be some of you in this room who remember back in the early 2000s, one of the esteemed auction houses in New York put a Florence McClung from, I think, the basement in MoMA in there. It was either in the Christie's East or the Sotheby's arcade sale. It wasn't even in the main sale. It was estimated at $400 to $600, and there was no picture. So I thought, it's damaged, it's ugly. They don't really know what they've got. I got no fewer than 4 excited phone calls in the course of a week, probably from some of you in this room going, Eleanor, did you see the listing of the Florence McClung? I said, yeah. And they said, Eleanor, I'm in New York. It's flat out gorgeous. These people are idiots. They were. That painting, estimated at $400,000 to $600,000, if my memory serves me, sold for $49,000, which tells me that there were at least 2 or more Texans in the room who thought they were going to get a bargain and ended up recalibrating Florence McClung's market. The DMA ended up having to completely redo the insurance values on their paintings as a result of that. I remember when D.D. Wigmore was down here and picked up the Everett Spruce screen of the catalpa trees and wanted to sell it to somebody here in Texas for $36,000, and we thought she was crazy. It's now in, I believe, in the Houston MFA, where we're all just stupid. It's just money. We should have just jumped at it. But that is kind of the nature of the game. The rest of the country doesn't need to make mistakes like that. I had the appropriate expert come down to Washington, D.C. the week after the sale, completely stunned. And I said, you know, if you'd done like 2 licks of research, you'd have realized she was a Texas artist, and then you would have bothered to call somebody in Texas and run the name by them and probably gotten a better idea of what you should have done with it, like put it in the main sale with a decent estimate on it. But frankly, it's people like me and museums like mine that need to do a better job of acknowledging the power of early modernism in Texas so that those mistakes don't happen. I know it's going to destroy your market. I mean, we ran into this with Spielberg and Lucas and Norman Rockwell. You can't touch one anymore. And they're both blaming each other for it. And it's like, dude, you're both in the room at the same time bidding on it. If you want to put a damper on it, collude. Like that never happens. Okay? But I want a Florence McClung to hang with our smaller Thomas Hart Benton, which is a painting called Witte, which expressed how Benton felt after he returned to Kansas City and torched himself at the Kansas City Art Institute. I'm not sure I can actually say this, but you can bleep it out if you need to. He got himself crosswise when he called the director of the Kansas City Art Institute a limp-wristed He ended up getting booted out. He came to Texas, where basically, I'm not sure all was forgiven, but certainly he did some really great works of art, including the Benton that happens to be at the DMA. There's no doubt in my mind that Corinne Spellman belongs at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I helped bring in road signs. It was one of the high water marks of my tenure at the DMA. I first saw her prints in an exhibition at Valley House Gallery, and Kevin and Cheryl put me in touch with Mick Spellman, who was willing to work with me to earmark a master set of her prints for the Dallas Museum of Art and this painting. And she went from 0 to 60 overnight. I will be deeply indebted forever to the Spellman family for being willing to do that. On the other hand, I still hunger for her work on a larger stage, because what she is doing with industrial modernism looks so good, for instance, with our Ralston Crawford of the Buffalo Grain elevators. It is not an idiom that is restricted only to certain parts of the country, and the more we can create the choir to which we can preach rather than having individual iconic images that seem to operate outside collegiality and time, the better. Crawford, of course, spent time down here in Texas, so there's a certain synergy there that I would like to pursue. Sticking with the women, I did find one other thing that I didn't expect to see that was a transfer into our collection, which is Catherine Hale Travis's Spring Flowers from 1934, and it came to us through the US Department of Labor in 1964. It's an amazing thought to me that she has preceded her husband into the Smithsonian collections. And given the Travis family history and all of that, I think it's kind of nice that she's there. And eventually he will be too if I have my way. But as much as I admire Catherine Hale Travis's floral paintings, what I really yearn for is this, the unfinished picture. It's a work that takes my breath away. From the first time I saw it, when I included it in a show at the McKinney Avenue Contemporary, those acid greens and vivid reds that scream with the emotional depth of the story behind it. This is the kind of painting that has both intense local and regional resonance and undeniable national staying power. And if there is one thing I believe in as much as anything, it is that each acquisition that I bring into the Smithsonian American Art Museum has to stand up to and amplify the strength of what is already there. I am not collecting for the basement. I am collecting for the walls. I want anything I bring in from Texas to bump something else to the second tier. That's the challenge. It's not enough to check off a name. It's about rebalancing what's on view and expanding our audience's exposure to the breadth and range of American art. I think about her work in dialogue with Charles Walter Stetson, who painted the flip side, if you will, to Travis's story. This is an Arcadian response to his leaving his wife, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the author of The Yellow Wallpaper, which is about the disillusion of her marriage. She descends into madness after being abandoned by her husband, this artist. And what American art has the capacity to do is chronicle the dark corners of our lives as well as our triumphs. That notion of, if you look at the two figures walking off in nude harmony, butts to the fore in the Catherine Hale Travis, and almost the same of them here with peacocks and cypress trees. It is that sense of the bittersweet. There's always more than one angle to a story. There is always more than one point of view, and it is glorious to be able to present those multiple points of view. We also hold the largest collection of African American art in any mainstream American art museum. It's a collection we maintain a very strong commitment to continuing to build in consideration of the newly created African American History and Culture Museum. We talk to each other about what we are collecting for, the stories we need to tell, the right works of art, so that we're not so much in competition as, again, creating that choir that can sing with one strong voice. And a complementary aspect of that is depicting the African American experience by artists who are both of that community and those who are not. We're rich in the work of William H. Johnson, whose Little Sis you see here on the left-hand side. That was a rescue mission. William H. Johnson's entire painterly career was in an unair-conditioned warehouse on the docks of New York for multiple decades. The paintings were in burlap and plywood, sort of. And part of that rescue with the Harriet and Harmon Kelly Foundation here in San Antonio was to preserve and conserve those works and then lend them around the country so that William H. Johnson is no longer just a niche player from Florence, South Carolina, the bulk of whose adult work ended up in my museum. Rather than hold on to it, we want to share it. We want people to know how good he is. So we're rich in the works of William H. Johnson, Jacob Lawrence, Elizabeth Catlett, Lois Malo Jones. But when I see paintings like Jerry Bywater's Negress, I realize that we are again speaking predominantly to the East Coast American scene. And given the vibrancy and strength of the African American community in Texas, and particularly in Dallas around Deep Ellum, we need to balance what we have from the Carolinas, from New York, and Chicago with the Great Migration during the Harlem Renaissance, with works made in and about Texas. Samuel Albert County. It's interesting that Francine mentioned yesterday that African American artists who were showing at the 1936 Texas Centennial were not in the Fine Arts Building. They were in the Hall of Negro Life. And the work you see here called My Guitar was in that exhibition in the Hall of Negro Life. I don't know where it is right now, but this is a painting that to me belongs in a national museum to give us the opportunity to tell that story. This is what I sit up late at night thinking about, which may just tell you how warped y'all made me when I was down here, but to me it also speaks to what I missed and what I still miss 16 years later coming back to you. It's not just about paintings. I have nothing in the collection by Dorothy Austin, Ali Tennant, or Octavio Medellin, but we have an extraordinarily strong collection of direct carved sculpture. And the work you see over on the far right is Selma Burke's painting sculpture that I deal with what Charles Venable used to call that flat stuff, so I tend to flatten it when I don't think about it hard enough. What you see is a work by Selma Burke that again speaks to all of that. Landscapes. I'm all about the landscapes. Y'all know that. It started with long before I got into art history. I was supposed to be a geologist, and a little thing like math got in the way. And you know, you gotta own your failures as well as your successes. That's one of the things Texas taught me, which is, you know, go down swinging, get up, figure out what went wrong, and dive back in and do it again. And I cannot do budgets to save my life. So I own that, and I spend as much time outdoors as I possibly can. And from the first time I saw one of Charles Bowling's paintings, I was bowled over. And it doesn't matter whether it's East Texas swamps or this church at the crossroads. These are roads I want to go down and swamps I want to walk through. They're just the kind of thing that really speaks to what it means to be a Texan, what it means to be an American, what it means to understand that Texas is not just one place. You know, the old story about, you know, reserving the right to split into 5 states if you really got your dander up, and, you know, you'd end up with East Texas and West Texas and the Gulf Coast. And in Dallas, on our bad days, we used to call it Baja Oklahoma. You know, there's nothing like blaming Oklahoma for what you don't like about Texas. So after a while, it seemed to make sense. You know, these are the things that matter. When I think of Jerry Bywater's Century Plant, I look at someone else who fell in love with the landscape and picked up that swirl from Mexican surrealism that just sort of sets the whole landscape in motion. But I also love when he goes into looking at what Texans do to carve out a future out of a featureless landscape. This is ambition at its best. Red, white, and blue, coming soon. You know, the homestead, no interest. What I love is the double entendre about finance and feasibility, which is a story that plays out all over the country as we go into subdivision land. This is a painting you can make such great stories from. It really does sort of make sense about how you build a future, that raw determination that everyone says, you're nuts, you're crazy, you're out of your mind. And again, why the hell not? This is the quintessential Texas picture about stubborn determination in the face of common sense to go ahead and do it anyway. I mean, if I remember correctly, Dallas was a failed utopian community called La Reunion before it became a successful town predicated on bribing the railroads to move the crossing from Fort Worth to Dallas so that everyone had to move the cows across the Trinity River to get them up to the Chicago stockyards, thereby essentially bribing their way into existence. you know, chops for the fact that no wonder Dallas and Fort Worth don't much get along all the time. I want to tell you a story about why I believe so strongly that Texas art has always belonged as part of the national mainstream and just hasn't really made it there yet. When I first opened the Museum of the Americas, I took one of my favorite art dealers, Jay Maroney, through the galleries in 1993. And I'm showing him what we have and what we don't have, because I'm kind of hoping that he's going to help me find some great things that I can convince people to help buy for me or give to me to help build this amazing collection. And Jay's taking notes, and we get around to the early modernist section, and Jay stops dead in front of William Lester's Three Crosses and just stares at it. And then he leans forward and he looks at the label, and it kind of pops back up again, and he looks at me and he goes, "Why the hell don't I know who this artist is?" And I said, "Because you New Yorkers are kind of provincial and you don't get out often enough." Which is its own truth. But the point is, Jay recognized in 1993 that this is a painting that belonged in any art museum, not just in a local art museum. I could not have agreed more. The surrealistic synthesis of close observation and a kind of dream state with a slightly nightmarish overlay kind of makes me happy, which, I don't know, I started out liking Albert Pinkham Ryder. I guess this really isn't that far a stretch. But this is an icon that is waiting to join the ranks of Grant Wood's American Gothic. There is nothing that keeps it from becoming another one of those paintings that is a wholly owned subsidiary of Texas, and I know is not leaving the Dallas Museum of Art, that's fine, but needs to be understood in a similar context as belonging to all of us. I look then at Otis Dozier. He paints so many different idioms, but I have to say one of my favorites is when you look at something like Crows in a Melon Patch, where they're normal and creepy and lyrical and disturbing all at the same time, which makes me, again, feel like we are telling not just the straightforward story of Texas, but also the resonant magic realist story of Texas. But I have to say that if there is one painting that keeps me up at night and has since I first laid eyes on it, it's Everett Spruce's West Texas Incident. I am so dying to understand that airplane, I cannot tell you. I am dying to understand the Quattrocento Italian approach to the Texas landscape. This is a painting that begs for further research, that has the capacity to stir the imagination and prompt admiration for what this artist and so many others like him accomplished. Speaking of Oklahoma, when I saw the title of this one, it's William Lester in Oklahoma, and I'm sitting there thinking, Oklahoma never looked so good. Or William Lester kind of thought that Quattrocento, Italy, and the spirit of Giotto reminded him of Oklahoma, which I thought was pretty charitable of him. But it's the kind of picture that you can conjure with. It's the kind of thing that leaves you realizing that the blending of real and surreal calls me like a siren. And in museums and museum basements across the country, there is an entire generation of work from the 1950s and early 1960s that we still do not understand. We can blame it on Jackson Pollock and most of our artists having a midlife crisis, trying to figure out how to do string paintings without losing the landscape. And we can understand that maybe the peyote was particularly good that year. I don't really understand what's going on in Texas art in the 1950s, but I sure as heck know that all of us are hanging on to what we've got in the desperate hope that some bright person is going to write the dissertation that's going to make it all make sense, and we will look like geniuses for already having it in hand. So for those of you holding on to it, where people end up looking at one end of Spruce's career to the other going, what the heck happened? Let me also say that it is a reminder that artists don't stand still in time. And for an artist to evolve, for him or her to have several different cultural moments and to watch their style flex and flow and become more experimental is also part of what the national scene is all about. Nobody is going to complain to me that I have 2 or 3 Frederick Church paintings that look different from the 1850s to the 1870s. Why should I settle for one frozen in amber moment for artists who had such dynamic careers? Perry Nichols was always one of my guilty pleasures. I missed meeting him only by a couple of months in Dallas. I did meet Alexander Hoag and had a great time up in Tulsa, Oklahoma with him and his daughter. But when Perry's memorial service took place in Dallas, the family came to me and asked if they could have 3 paintings on view on easels in the vestibule of the church where the memorial service was being handled. And again, it's the reason I think that the Texas motto ought to be, why the hell not? Because I went back and said, can we do this? And the answer was, well, sure, why the hell not? And so I trucked 3 of his paintings and 3 easels up to the vestibule within a year of my arriving in Texas in order for the family and everyone else to admire what he had done, but to also marvel at the fact that this is a man who, like a chameleon, changed his colors every single decade. The DMA is fortunate. They've got him as a folk artist. They've got him as a regionalist. They've got him as a magic realist. They've got him as a still life painter. It's really quite extraordinary. And when I look at what he can do with still life and with landscape, I realize that, again, that Mexican inflection that we have in some of our works. I think of our Luis Guglielmi town square from 1937, which looks like De Chirico landed at the middle of New England. That is bereft of signs of life, but teeming with a sense that something has just happened or is about to happen that will simply change everything. I look at Priscilla Roberts, whose work in our collection is Lincoln's life mask set against the silhouette of the Nike of Samothrace, the winged victory, as a meditation on the bittersweet victory and loss that Lincoln experienced and the country experienced in 1 week's time at the end of the American Civil War. There's so much more we need to be able to say about the varied strains of realism in American art, and so much that Texas has to offer in expanding and, frankly, dominating that conversation. Our museum never gave up on representational art, but what we did do was we selectively cherry-picked what we showed. The American scene, as Francine said, is our scene. And coast to coast, there are major voices that have yet to join the dialogue, and stories, some of which can only be told from a Texas point of view. And so I stand before you to ask for your help in making sure that Texas is properly represented as part of a national dialogue in American art. Not by sweeping up vast quantities of Texas art, don't worry about that, I did not bring a Hoover vacuum cleaner with me, but by making sure that those few chosen paintings and sculptures and works on paper are strong enough to hang in the permanent collection galleries, to be able to be in the company of the artists who, for the present, are better known and more widely admired. Let me use the clout of the Smithsonian in order to give you the promise of the 1930s, that Texas art is American art, that the Texas scene is the American scene. We have close to 2,000 boots-on-the-ground visitors every year. We have countless more who encounter our collection through our website. We are becoming one of the ways people understand outside the classroom what American art means, and I feel the absence of the voices that matter so much here in Texas. Help me change the way we think about the 19th and the 20th century so that nobody ever doubts that Texas has an artistic tradition that can hold its own with the best of them. Thank you very much. Y'all are very nice. You haven't thrown anything at me yet. I appreciate that. I know that we are going to roll into the CASETA Awards, but if any of you have any specific questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. And if any of you want to know more about my wish list beyond, oh, let's say I stack the deck with some of the things I would most like to see come in, I am more than happy to talk to you about how we're going to buttonhole your best friend when you try to deflect me from buttonholing you. We have a question.
I'd like to know how much of the Smithsonian collection is through gifts, and how selective are you about accepting them? Plus, I want to say that I know that you know that to be a good painter, it has to speak.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. I did a lecture once on the history of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I called it Collecting Collectors, because every museum is shaped more by gifts than it is by purchases. That's just a financial, pragmatic reality. The Smithsonian American Art Museum is lucky we got started, actually right about the same time the DMA did. We were about 1906. But the collections really stretch back to the founding of the institution in 1849. We rely heavily on gifts. It is simply impossible to buy your way to the top unless you are the Getty, Cleveland maybe, and one or two other places. Even the Metropolitan Museum of Art only rarely makes a purchase that is commensurate in quality with what they are able to coax out of longtime supporters or people where, again, they can convince them that the vision matches the hit when we asked to take something out of your living room. So from that standpoint, I would say that the vast majority of the works in the Smithsonian American Art Museum came to us as gifts. We had gifts from artists, gifts from families of artists, gifts from first-generation collectors, second generations, third generation collectors, from people whose names are, legendary, etched into the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because we don't etch people's names in, so I can't say that, to people that we have never met before who simply come in and say, I notice you're missing something. Is that because you don't want it, or is that because you can't find one that you like? And that gets to the point of quality. Because we already have such a large collection, but because that collection still has meaningful gaps, here's the trick. I don't want to check off a list of names. This is not a contest to see how many different artists I can manage to get onto my website or into my basement. I am interested in collecting for the galleries. I am interested in collecting for what people see without an appointment when they walk into the museum. What I really want is for a couple of the works that I've shown you today to bump off the second and third works by equally or better known artists where the work by the Texas artist is better. We have a pretty rigorous process that has to do with me talking the rest of the curators into the fact that I know what I'm doing, talking my director into believing that, and then talking my board into doing that. It is a question that is made more difficult if any of those constituencies aren't familiar with the name of the artist, which is where I earn my keep. It is my job to give them the background, to understand that they may not have heard this artist, but that's their problem, not mine, and certainly not the work of art. So I am very selective about what I do because I want it to win. I don't want to propose something that isn't going to make the cut. I want to propose something where someone has that head-slapping moment like the one Jay Maroney had and said, why haven't I ever heard of this artist? Or, I'd heard of him, I never knew he or she could be that good. Yeah, we got a question over here. Marie, what you got on your mind? May I just say that Marie Half was one of the first people I met in 1992 when I arrived in Texas. Her late husband, Hugh, was on the board and the collections committee at the DMA, and here I am, terrified, in my very first board meeting, and he comes up to me and he goes, you know, you just really need to come down to San Antonio and see my collection. And the warmth that both of them extended to me then has been constant ever since then. And may I just say what a great pleasure it is every time I bump into Marie. It's always a wonderful time, and it just makes me that much more homesick for having left here in the first place. So now that I've said that, what are you going to do to me?
I think you're cute too. As always, your talk was excellent. I was hoping that there was some place that we could get a copy of the video, or from YouTube, or someplace. I want to use this for reference, and I imagine some of you would too.
Outstanding. My understanding is that actually this is being recorded. I am on a live mic, so I'm not going to say anything that I don't want captured for posterity, although I may pay these people to excise a few things if it looks like it's going to get awkward.
Wristed?
Yeah. My understanding is that this will be massaged and then put up on the CASETA website for all of you to distribute far and wide. My sense is this whole conference, and frankly every conference that CASETA has sponsored, has helped build a wave of interest and a wave of activity when it comes to understanding and really appreciating all facets of early Texas art and culture. The fact that CASETA and TACO and all of the other pocket groups around this state that have developed over the last 2 decades have been indefatigable in their desire to rehabilitate artists' reputations, seek out relatives of artists, look for signature works, and reclaim your own heritage is nothing short of extraordinary. The fact that you've done such a good job is the reason that people like me end up thinking that we need to take some of that away from people like you in order to let your children fledge and move on past college and become part of the big world where you can look back on them and say, yeah, and that one's in the Smithsonian. Some things belong locally, some things belong nationally, and my job is to help figure out how to make all of that happen, but it doesn't happen without all of you. It doesn't happen without organizations like CASETA and conferences like this. So please understand that you are part of what makes Texas art, and part of the American scene. And now I'm going to... Oh, Pete.
Boy, we sure do miss you.
Well, the feeling is mutual. The feeling is mutual.
I was just going to add, it's the underbidder on that Florence McClung was my mom, Cherry Renoni, and I walked in the room and heard what she was bidding on it. It's my fault she didn't get it. So, sorry about that, Mom.
Thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. One of the things you don't often get is the backstory behind all of that, which is half the fun, because the chase is 90% of it, and the one that got away is always the one that keeps you up late at night. But thank you for that. And again, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. It's a pleasure to be back.